So today's speaker, we have Professor Peter Eigen. So originally a lawyer, and he's worked on economic development for the last 25 years. Worked a lot of the last 25 years at the World Bank, especially in Africa and Latin America. And he founded one of the advisory boards for Transparency International. He's also taught at the University of Johns Hopkins and Harvard. And Berlin's, I can't really say this, it's Free University. How do you say it?
Well, Freie Universität, is that what you mean?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, please help me welcome Peter Eigen.
Thank you. No, it's fine. Well, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be invited here. At first, I didn't know what it meant to be an impactful person. I only remember that my daughter was the only person who never allowed me any impact on her education. but she educated me quite severely. But other than that, I think this is a wonderful initiative of yours, and I feel greatly honored and excited that you think that I deserve to talk to you. I will be very open and very personal and very informal because you, I think, want to share a little bit the feelings I had and the instincts and the excitement and also the failures which I witnessed when I started my career as a civil society activist. In fact, I started after the university, after working at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., in a legal institute. I started very normal. I started at the World Bank, in the legal department of the World Bank. I was a very good soldier in the World Bank. I accepted their rules. I accepted their instructions to try to do something useful for the poor people in the world and try to contribute a bit to more justice and more peace and more openness in the world. Eventually ended up as a director for East Africa in Nairobi. And this is basically when the activities which interest you started. They started by giving me a very strong sense that everything we were trying to do to promote economic and social development of the countries in Africa, in particular the countries around Kenya, was being undermined by corruption. I thought for a while that this is a very domestic thing of our partner countries, and therefore I accepted for a long time, for nearly 20 years, that the World Bank had a rule which said this is a local, political, social, cultural affair. You are not allowed to really meddle in these things. And I was quite happy about this policy of the World Bank. In fact, it's enshrined, as some of you may know, in the charter of the World Bank. I was particularly happy when I was working on countries which were not particularly popular in the West at the time, because as you know, the United States is very influential at the World Bank, and therefore when I worked on Tanzania, for instance, where Julius Nyerere at the time was trying to promote justice and more equitable development, not many people in the World Bank and in the board of the bank liked it. But, of course, there was a rule: we don't meddle in the internal affairs of our partner countries. So I was able to help Julius Nyerere and his government in the most insane policies, which some people would say nowadays, like the Ujamaa policies, and the World Bank did not try to prevent it. But later, after 20 years in other countries, in Latin America and Asia, I found that this refusal of the World Bank to get involved in politics, to get involved in the question of democracy, of participation of the people, the question of integrity of the leadership in many of the countries, that this was a mistake. It was a mistake of the World Bank, I thought. And therefore, after a few years in Nairobi, where I saw that very bad projects were being promoted by the representatives of companies from the north, from Europe, from Germany, but also from Canada, from Japan, from the US. Many of these projects were driven by an unholy alliance between these promoters from the north and corrupt decision makers in Africa. I saw this very clearly in projects like huge hydropower projects, for instance, where we knew that they would not only be useless for the economy, say, of Kenya, but that they would even be very damaging. They would be damaging to the environment, they would be damaging for the people, for hundreds of thousands of people who would be resettled, for undermining, for instance, underwater, underground water flows, which would basically destroy the conditions of the Samburu and the Turkana people in the north with their cattle. We saw this, and we rejected those projects as projects for the donor community. But we saw that as soon as we rejected a project, it was a consortium of commercial banks, of export financing agencies, of the banks of the suppliers from Germany and from UK, France, who then very quickly funded these projects. Projects which were even more expensive than the ones which we had rejected, which didn't have the safeguards which normally come with World Bank and donor finance projects. And so I saw how through corruption, projects were driven into the developing world, which were basically destroying the economic potential and the potential of the people in these countries. I very quickly noticed that probably these white elephant projects, which were useless, if not damaging, were the main reason for the misery and the poverty and the environmental destruction and so on in many of these countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So suddenly I began to doubt that the refusal of the World Bank to develop an anti-corruption program for its partner countries was very damaging to our mandate. So I began to develop concepts because many even companies from Germany and so on, they complained that there was too much demand for corruption. So I said, why don't we help these companies so they don't have to bribe anybody by organizing a coalition of companies, supplier companies, to make sure that they all stop bribing at the same time. So that was the idea which I had in 88, 89. And in fact, I made a speech to a meeting of all resident representatives of the World Bank in Swaziland, all the resident representatives in Africa. And to my great delight, about 15 of my colleagues totally agreed and said, why don't we get together and design a systemic approach on how to stop corruption, to stop in particular international corruption in our countries. The interesting thing was that after a very brief period, after about 2 or 3 weeks, I received a memorandum from the legal department of the World Bank which said, you are not allowed to stop corruption. This is not our mandate. This is, as I said in the beginning, this is a local matter, this is a political matter, and therefore we are not allowed to look into this. Now, I thought I can do this after business hours, after 5 o'clock every day, and I continued the work on my own free time. And before I knew it, I received a memorandum from the president of the World Bank this time, who said, what you are doing is embarrassing, it is silly, it is romantic, it is unprofessional, for us at the World Bank, this is rather shameful to have one of our directors do this kind of stuff. So we want you to stop this immediately. So I had a choice to either stop corruption, fight, or to leave the bank. At that time, I was living with my late wife, who was working as a doctor in various clinics in the slums of Nairobi and so on. And she experienced that a health project which we had funded and which we had designed so that she, in her clinic, which was run by a Red Crescent organization, a clinic against AIDS, that this clinic never was built. They basically tore down an old ramshackle building and created space for that AIDS clinic, but the money never came. So I called the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance. I called the Minister of Health, who, by the way, was later the president of Kenya, Mr. Kibaki. I said, "Where is the money?" They said, "Oh, yeah, we just send it to the other ministry, and I don't know, I check it," and so on. And for about a year, this money didn't come. In the meantime, the slums closed over the space which they had created. And my wife gave me a very hard time. She said, "This rule which you have there at the World Bank is totally inhumane and unacceptable. You impose so many conditions on Africa and Latin America and Asia, on subsidies, on interest rates, on exchange rates, and so on. And now suddenly, when it comes to corruption, you turn a blind eye to what is happening in this world." So it was this pressure, partly from home, but also the pressure from partners who, like myself, had started to look at corruption as one of the most damaging and dangerous things happening in these countries at the time, that I left the World Bank. I went home and I continued the work with the people who had earlier committed themselves to work with me on this task force. And I very quickly found out what the real reason was for the World Bank's reluctance to get involved. The reason was simply that most of the member countries of the World Bank, including Germany, including France, the UK, Japan, Canada, believed that corruption was something unavoidable. Corruption was part of a globalized economy where there was no governance, there was no regulation which had the authority to deal with the global markets, and therefore one simply had to fend for oneself. There was a free-for-all, and therefore, for instance, the German government allowed German companies to systematically bribe in Africa and Asia, Latin America. Huge amounts of money were spent at the time. Now the World Bank estimates that about $1 trillion every year is spent on corrupt deals. In my opinion, the damage done to development is much more than these $1 trillion. It's a lot of money, but the real damage was the perversion of economic management, of economic decision-making. The wrong projects were built, over-designed projects were built. The macroeconomic policies of a country were perverted, and therefore basically the projects which were funded by the development partners were doomed to failure, because the reality of the interaction between these former colonies and their metropolitan friends in Europe and everywhere in the world was such that corruption totally destroyed the chances of building a sound economy in many of these countries. I was convinced at the time that at least 1/3 of the international indebtedness of the developing world was based on corruption, was based on the fact that the promoters, say, from big companies in Germany or the UK, they would go into the countries, they would tempt the decision makers, ministers, presidents, heads of parastatal companies to do the wrong things, and go home to their home countries and say, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, these people, they like corruption. They want corruption. So if we want to do business there, we have to live up to their expectations. Who are we to impose our sort of Judeo-Christian European values of honesty on these people? So it's our respect for the local culture in the countries where we want to do business, in China, in Nigeria, in Russia, which forces us to allow our companies to systematically bribe. And when I say systematically, it is not $500,000 for a minister or $5 million. It is $10 million, $50 million on Swiss bank accounts, on bank accounts. Well, you all read nowadays about the Panama Papers, to some tax havens and so on, where, of course, the local decision makers could expect that nobody ever finds out, that suddenly they are rich, suddenly they can send their children to expensive schools like to Stanford, that suddenly they can go shopping in London, they can buy luxury apartments and yachts. And this is the reason why most of the leaders in Africa are much richer than the leaders of the rich countries. I mean, if I look at the ministers in the German government, none of them has a yacht, or none of them has apartments in London and so on. But of course, President Moi at the time, who in a wonderful way reinvented the term l'état c'est moi, in Kenya, they were the richest people of the world. So the question was, what can one do? And this was the experience which I would like to share with you, because I wanted to have a conference in Berlin. I wanted to bring together these people who had promised to support me. I received from two development agencies in Germany 9,500 Deutschmarks each in order to organize a first conference. Because these two development agencies were entitled to organize conferences without the permission of the ministry, as long as the money they spent was below 10,000 Deutschmarks. And so with this money, I invited people, they bought tickets and so on. We rented a room in one of the conference centers in Berlin. But the deputy minister of development in Germany, whom I knew from earlier encounters, in fact, he has been flying around in the corporate airplane of Tiny Roland, whom the Africa connoisseurs among you know. He represented basically huge British interests, post-colonial interests in plantations and so on in Kenya and other places. And he heard that I had received 2 times 9,500 Deutschmark, and he said, if you add these two, it's more than 10,000. And so he intervened and stopped me, and so I had to write emails. Well, there were no emails at the time yet. I had to write to everybody and ask them that we had to cancel the conference. Why? Because the German government wanted to continue this system of allowing German companies to systematically go out there and bribe decision makers in Africa and Latin America and Asia and everywhere. So the question was, how do we overcome that hostility? And I don't want to make a long story too boring for you, but our idea was then to work together with civil society, other civil society organizations, with companies, and with and the government. The governments in Africa and Asia and Latin America, but also the government in the home countries of our companies. And we organized 3 conferences. At that time, we had been invited already by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, by the OECD, which was trying again under American sponsorship to do something about international corruption. Because in the US, I should say, Jimmy Carter had introduced the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. So American companies were not allowed to bribe outside America. And of course, the American companies didn't like it. In particular, they didn't like that the companies from other countries continued to be allowed to do it. even got tax write-offs for it and subsidies and so on. And so the Americans had tried many, many times in the UN system, but also in regional banks, in the World Bank, in different places to introduce a system against international bribery. But they never succeeded because all the other companies, the other countries, the other member countries of the World Bank, they decided, well, why are the Americans so stupid to not allow their companies to bribe? For us, this is a wonderful competitive advantage. And therefore, for many, many years, for decades, there was a real gap between the ethics, I would say, of American companies and the other companies from rich countries, which officially allowed bribery and officially even were in giving this in their tax receipts. They would say, I gave $5 million to the mayor of Warsaw, or $10 million to the minister of energy of this country or that country. And then they could deduct this from their taxable income in Germany. It was a scandal. And so in that situation, I was trying to stand up, and our great hope was that we would explain to the private sector in Germany that for them it would be much better if they would be competing in a global market without corruption, because they were offering good products, they were offering good prices, they were offering reliable deliveries, and therefore for them it would be much better if everybody would stop bribing at once. So we organized 3 conferences on an island on the Wannsee. In fact, the first one was even chaired by the former president of Germany, Richard von Weizsäcker, because funnily, the big companies like Siemens and MAN and Daimler Chrysler and ABB, they didn't dare to meet us because they thought we would blame them and we would shame them somehow through our irresponsible activities. Of course, many companies feel that civil society organizations are mainly throwing bricks through the windows of McDonald's and so on, rather than have good arguments for better governance. In these 3 meetings, over a course of 2 years, we basically convinced these business representatives that it would be in their interest to participate at the OECD effort to reduce international corruption. We were invited by the OECD, again at the insistence of the Americans, of a Canadian Secretary General of the OECD, much to the chagrin of the German representative, who always said that I'm offending them. They asked the OECD to not allow me to join these conferences, but they were always outvoted by the other members of the OECD. So eventually, we organized an open letter by these business people to Helmut Kohl's government, asking the Minister of Commerce of Germany to participate at the OECD effort to stop foreign bribery. The same minister who had earlier said in public that you cannot stop bribery, that would mean destruction of German jobs, as if the jobs of a corrupt company are more important than the jobs of an honest company. So this public letter just hit like a thunderbolt the German politics. And suddenly the German government joined this effort at the OECD. In fact, they went further than the other members of the OECD. They demanded a binding, mandatory convention, which the 33 members of the OECD would sign, committing them to change their law, to make it a crime, to bribe in the international marketplace. Well, this was the absolute victory of our effort, because in 1997 the OECD convention was signed. In 1999 it entered into force. In May 1999 the Social Democrats had taken over the government in Germany. They very quickly abandoned this tax deductibility of foreign bribes, And all of the other countries basically committed themselves to stop international bribery. So from one day to the other, we had the law on our side, partly because we worked in many, many different construction sites. I mean, in Germany, for instance, we worked very hard with other NGOs. We worked very hard with the faith-based organizations, with academia. Many of the people who had earlier defended foreign bribery, they now changed their minds and said, yes, bribery is so damaging, we have to stop. So in a way, we created a wave and we could ride on the crest of that wave into a system where then the United Nations passed its anti-corruption convention. The World Bank, under the leadership of Jim Wolfenson, became a very, very tough anti-corruption agency. I mean, they totally changed and turned from Saulus to Paulus. So in many ways, the whole system has changed. But civil society still had to continue to look over the shoulder of governments and the private sector. We saw that in some countries, like in Japan, for instance, practically nothing was done to enforce the OECD convention. Even in the UK, Tony Blair's government, who had been very verbally extremely supportive of the OECD convention, they didn't do anything to implement it. In fact, some of you may know this really scandalous corruption case where British Aerospace had paid about 100 million pounds sterling every year to the son of the Saudi defense minister for 10 years, basically trying to organize a sale of 44 billion sterling worth of military equipment to Saudi Arabia. Of course, people, when they see now that the king of Saudi Arabia was one of the people mentioned in the Panama Papers, they remember that. This was an amazing corruption case. It was called El Yamama. And very interesting that Tony Blair felt that they should not prosecute it, even though they had committed themselves under the OECD convention. He stopped, his Attorney General stopped the Serious Fraud Office in London. A number of NGOs, including Transparency International, our national chapter in the UK, appealed against this. They won in the High Court in the UK. And therefore, for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, read the opinion of Chief Justice Cohen of the High Court, who basically tore apart this argument that you shouldn't hurt the Saudi royal family, which was Tony Blair's argument. But then the government of Tony Blair appealed against that decision, and the House of Lords decided that the Attorney General was right to stop this prosecution. So this happened only about 6 years ago, and it was only in the final months of the tenure of the Blair government that in the UK the laws were changed basically to implement the obligations under the binding convention of the OECD of 1999. So in some countries the authorities were more diligent in prosecuting foreign bribery. In Germany, for instance, right now we have about 120 companies, very, very respectable global companies, which are being prosecuted in criminal proceedings because they continued bribing in the international marketplace. I'm telling you this not in order to sort of put dirt on my own country, but to say how important it is that civil society remains involved. And in fact, this is probably one of the messages which I would very much like to convey to all of you, is none of the three actors of governance, neither the governments of nation states, nor the private sector itself, even the most powerful companies, international companies, nor civil society alone can deal with the shortcomings of global governance. You need the three together. It's a magical triangle of good governance. And in my opinion, this is the great hope of overcoming what I would call failing governance in the globalized economy. Failing governance is a tough word, but it's, if you look at the type of world which we have created in the last couple of years, you know, the millions of refugees, the destruction of the environment, the poverty which still exists, the disease and misery and bloodshed and so on in many parts of the world, we have to simply recognize we have allowed a global economy to develop in a way that it is escaping any kind of political regulation. And the reason is quite simple. We rely too much on national governments, on governments of nation states. And everybody knows that these governments don't have the global reach to deal with a global market. They don't have the time horizon to deal with the real issues of global governance. And they are serving constituencies which are much too diverse and much too splintered in order to develop a joint approach to address global issues. And this is basically the context within which I have made these experiences with Transparency International. I should be very honest, at the beginning, when we started Transparency International, I was not really familiar with this sort of powerful role which civil society organizations can play. Also in other areas, you know, human rights, you know, with Amnesty International, with Oxfam, in environment, Greenpeace, and so many organizations which operate driven by people and driven with the idea that you have to complement what governments and the intergovernmental organizations can do, and trying to deal with the private sector, which normally has different mandates than the common good. So this is basically what I wanted to share with you with Transparency International, but it led then to the creation of similar other institutions. I mean, for instance, at the end of my term at Transparency International, I left Transparency International as chair of Transparency International in 2005, after 12 years. And I'm now the chairman of the advisory council. But I, at that time, then felt we have to be more systematic with approaching the risks and opportunities of civil society. So we created a think tank, which was called the Berlin Civil Society Center. Again, I brought together people from all over the world interested in trying to focus on the strengths of civil society and what the requirement would be in order to make them legitimate voice for the common good. And I worked for a whole year, funded by the Vodafone Foundation, to develop a feasibility study of creating such a civil society center. But at the end of the year, the Vodafone Foundation refused to fund the creation of it. They only funded the study. And so therefore I thought I have to give it up. I feel that the foundation was mainly shocked by the idea that I said we will not accept any limitation on what we do with our civil society center. In particular, we might even look at electromagnetic waves and so on, which may be harmful to the people. And they said, no, this is something which we do ourselves. You know. So eventually I had this wonderful feasibility study, but no money to create it. And I had already talked to the head of Save the Children in London. I said, you can come and become my managing director. So I called him. I said, I'm sorry, the thing is off. You don't get the money. And he said, I'm coming anyhow. So I'm coming and join you free of charge. And the two of us will set this up together. And you have to promise me that once we get money, once we get support, that I will get a nice salary as a managing director. I promised this to him, and he was great. He invented, for instance, an idea of funding this, which is pure genius. We basically sold our own shares to big civil society organizations, Amnesty International, to Oxfam, to Save the Children. All of them had to pay $10,000 a year to own our center. And that gave us enough money for him to pay himself and his staff a salary. So this is sort of one idea which I can recommend. Try to set something up and then sell it to the people who would be the beneficiaries of it. Then the next thing came my way was the need to do something in oil and gas, in mining, because this is an area where corruption is particularly vicious, because there's a lot of money playing a role in that sector. If you build a platform, an oil platform, in the territorial waters, say, of Equatorial Guinea, you very quickly pay $3-4 billion. And therefore, of course, Exxon, which is very active in Equatorial Guinea, they have the idea we need stability, we need predictability, that we can make enough money in order to recover our investment. And so for the companies to bribe is extremely tempting. And of course for a president like President Ngema, who has practically no prospect, has a very small salary, he cannot send his children to good universities, and he doesn't know whether he will be killed like he killed his uncle when he came to power. The idea of building up a trust fund somewhere in the Bahamas or in Panama and so on is extremely tempting. So in this area of extractive industries, corruption is particularly vicious, and you have to approach very special ideas, which we did at the time to set up the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. By now we have about 51 countries which report every year in reliable reports resulting from deliberations of multi-stakeholder working groups in the country, again, including this magical triangle I've been mentioning, about the payments of oil and gas and mining companies to their host countries. In many countries, huge amounts of money. In Nigeria, $50 billion, $54 billion 1 year. Money which normally is kept secret by the power elites in the country. So that it's not surprising that right now, for instance, the new president of Nigeria has suddenly found that $23 billion has fallen between the cracks. They don't know where it is. So this is being changed by creating a multi-stakeholder transparency project for oil and gas. And this in turn is so encouraging that we are now trying to create similar transparency projects in fisheries, where many coastal countries in Africa, for instance, suffer from the fact that huge fishing fleets from China, from Russia, from Spain come and basically catch the fish which the traditional fishermen cannot find anymore, with huge consequences. I see you. So, I mean, these kind of transparency projects, including also one in the garment sector, after the Rana Plaza accident in Bangladesh, we are trying to do the same thing in the garment sector. In my opinion, are a hope for creating better governance, but it has to be moderate. One has to find common interest of these three actors: government, civil society, and private sector. One has to gradually build up their ambition to find more normative standards, like they are doing in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative right now. And I have the feeling this is a way which can lead to better governance. But it means, of course, that civil society has to shape art itself. It has to have NGOs have to have more transparent governance themselves. They have to account for their funds. They have to account for their decision-making processes. They have to be competent. I mean, many NGOs are not very competent, so they mobilize people on the street, like in the case of Brand Spa, for instance, Greenpeace has done, to promote a campaign which in the final analysis was not very, the content was not very, very useful. And perhaps most importantly, civil society organizations have to learn to work with the other actors. I mean, in America, many civil society organizations are very shy to work with governments. They feel they lose their independence if they work with government, if they accept money from government. In Europe, many NGOs are scared to deal with the private sector. We at Transparency International, we basically take money and support from everywhere. So when you're leaving the room, we are going to make a collection here from all of you. No, but the point is, I really feel you have to have a system of protecting your independence, your reputation, of not being in the pocket of anybody, and have to work with the other actors. On the other hand, the other actors have to also allow civil society to work. I mean, right now we have a huge problem that in many countries, in particular in authoritarian countries like Russia and Ethiopia and Angola, that the space of civil society is severely limited. I mean, civil society activists are harassed, they're put in jail, and therefore we have to learn to harness the benefits of this magical triangle which I've been mentioning. If we succeed to do this, I think we can hope for possibly for a better world which is more fair and more peaceful and more just than what we have right now. Well, there was 42 minutes. Is this okay?
Yeah, very good.
Thank you. Are you
Now
going
we'll
to?
open it up to question and answers. Anyone have a question?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
How effective do you think laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act are?
Yes.
Is there anything that you would do to make them stronger?
Could you repeat that question because I didn't acoustically quite get it?
How effective are laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices
Yeah.
Act, and what could be done, if anything, to make them more effective?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was extremely effective. I mean, I remember I was close to some people from Siemens, and they were visiting us in Washington, and they said this is nonsense, that the Americans are now introducing this, because all of our projects, in Latin America, in Paraguay, or in Argentina, or in Venezuela, and so on, we always have to pay the local decision makers, and in fact they felt that they would have to go into some kind of coalition with American companies who were not allowed to pay bribes in order to together then get contracts, and the Germans or the Brits or the French would do the bribing. Now the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is quite smart in the sense that they demand due diligence. They demand that American companies have to try to make sure there's no corruption involved, in particular when they have local partners. Very often they think that the local partners can do the bribing and they reap the benefits. But the Justice Department and the Security and Exchange Commission, which are enforcing in the United States the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, are pretty tough, and their penalties are very high. I mean, now they're in the billions fact, they also punish companies which are registered in the United States on the stock exchanges. So Siemens, for instance, is listed on the stock exchange in the United States, and therefore the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is applied to them. They had to pay about $200 million in fines in Germany, Siemens, but they had to pay about $1 billion in fines in the US. And they took American lawyers to basically arrange a settlement with the Justice Department. I think the implementation was very helpful, but of course the Americans over time became very angry, the American business community, that very often they would be in a competitive situation with German, British, French, Japanese companies, and they knew the others had paid bribes. And therefore they were pretty devious, the American companies, in finding ways to have the same effect. So at one point in 2003 or so, or even a little earlier than that, we organized a bribe payers index. I mean, many of you may know the corruption perception index, which we do every year. But we organized the bribe payers index, which was measuring the propensity of companies from various countries, from exporting countries to bribe, basically 20 exporting countries. And I remember the MacArthur Foundation was funding that. And after a while, we came with the results. And to the great shock of the Americans, they found that the American companies were worse than in our ranking than the French and the Germans. I mean, the Americans had a very, very strong sort of moral sense of superiority, that they said, well, you Germans, you are conspiring in crime, you're dealing with these dictators, with these kleptocrats over in the world. We, however, we are honest. And in our index, which came out of this, the Americans ranked behind the French, behind the Germans. So it was a huge shock for them. So at least this index, which we repeat every 2 years, showed that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is not quite as effective as the Americans wanted it to be. And many of you know that there were huge American corruption cases. Boeing was caught, IBM was caught in Argentina, and so on. So in many ways, I'm afraid the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was very good in intention, and it was also very good in helping us to introduce something similar in other countries. One thing I found particularly harmful was that the American business community insisted in the early 80s that facilitation payments should be allowed. And they are allowed under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Facilitation payments are payments which are small, $500, $1,000 or so, to basically facilitate actions of civil society, of public officials outside the country, which are in themselves not illegal. So if, say, the captain of a ship pays to the director of a port $1,000 to get, say, perishable goods unloaded during the weekend or something like that, this is a typical facilitation payment. We at Transparency International, we didn't tolerate that. We thought this has a tremendous distorting effect, and therefore we would not allow it. And just to give you a little bit of a sense how difficult our work is, because the American companies who are trying to work with us, they say, we work with you, but we want to have the right to pay facilitation payments. And we said, no, you cannot. If you want to apply our index, our standards for business, our code of conduct, there's no allowance for facilitation payments. On that basis then, the organizer of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, he told me, if you don't allow this under your guidelines, I will start my own guidelines, where my American members of the World Economic Forum, they get a clear permit for facilitation payments. So they developed PACHI, which is a special World Economic Forum standard competing with ours, which allows facilitation payments, and therefore all American companies and so on are trying to adopt this. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has this sort of Achilles heel, but basically I'm very, very grateful to Jimmy Carter to have pushed this after the Watergate affair. In fact, he is on my advisory council, and I'm very proud of that. Yes? No?
Has the World Bank changed its perspective or its policies?
Mm-hmm.
And is there any more oversight over the distribution of funds for the World Bank? For example, do you think that clinic now
Mm-hmm.
would it end up being built or not?
They have totally changed. I mean, during the first, I would say, 4 years of our existence, they have been fighting us. In particular, the legal department. They said what we are proposing is illegal under the charter of the World Bank. We were trying to get a system of blacklisting of companies which are caught bribing. And I mean, we feel in general that criminal sanctions are a very blunt weapon because you have the burden of proof. It's very hard to convict somebody in a criminal proceeding. But there are other legal instruments, like, for instance, blacklisting of companies, where you don't have the burden of proof. You just can present a high probability that something has happened. And we wanted the World Bank to put in place a blacklisting system where whenever they find some companies bribing, they exclude them from future bidding for World Bank finance projects. And the legal department was just hitting the roof because one of the golden rules of the World Bank is that all companies which operate from the territories of members of the World Bank get free access to compete for World Bank finance projects. And in my opinion, it was a totally stupid legal decision of the legal department. I myself had been working in the legal department of the World Bank. In fact, I drafted the procurement guidelines of the World Bank in 1969. So I know quite a bit about this. And of course, through a blacklisting system, you strengthen the competitiveness and you don't exclude and reduce the competition. But at the time, the General Counsel of the World Bank was doing everything to snuff us off the table. And we were really the enemy number one of the World Bank. Interesting for the Americans among you, Robert McNamara, who had been the president of the World Bank, he joined me. He came to our launch in 1993 to Berlin. And in fact, he said this idea of creating integrity pacts in corrupt situations, in competitive situations, is great. And I will give you $10,000 out of my own pocket if you get the first countries to accept this instrument. Now, he went with me to 6 different presidents in Africa. And these presidents demanded from the World Bank that their World Bank finance projects should be under this rule of, first of all, having an integrity pact where all competitors have to agree, have to have an anti-corruption compliance system, but also have to promise not to bribe and have to, in fact, accept sanctions in case they are caught bribing. And secondly, to have this sort of blacklisting system. And he was furious during the last years of his life that the World Bank did not do this. And then came Jim Wolfenson. And Jim Wolfenson became a tremendous supporter of Transparency International. We had a whole day of joint seminars about corruption in June 1996. And in fact, in October of that year, Jim Wolfenson gave the speech in Hong Kong about the cancer of corruption. And after that, he invited us, our people from Berlin, but also from other parts of the world, to come into the World Bank and try to introduce anti-corruption mechanisms in a lot of the World Bank's sectoral and and macroeconomic policies. So it was an amazing story. So the World Bank has joined the anti-corruption community, but for a long time, the mass of the people, the middle-level management of the World Bank, they didn't participate in this. I remember I visited people in my own country, in Kenya, where I had been the regional director, and the people there would say, look, if we find corruption in one of our contracts, in one of our projects, we don't tell anybody, because we don't want our projects to be held up. These guys in Washington, they don't know what they are talking about. So we will not stop a project in the education sector, in the health sector, where we have been working for years, and suddenly we see a little bit of corruption of the wife of the minister or something like that. We are not stupid enough to stop our projects and destroy the lives of 100,000 school children who don't get to go to school and so on. So I mean, there's this kind of trade-off which we saw, and there were some parts of the World Bank. I mean, for instance, in Indonesia, there was a director who said Suharto is stealing money right and left, $30 billion, his family. But he's also fighting poverty. So millions of people are rising out of poverty. So that's a small price we pay. Who cares whether Suharto is rich or poor? So I mean, and these people were then fired afterwards. So right now there is a very, very tough system. And in fact, under Wolfowitz, it became even tougher. And I think under Zöllig and now under Jim Kim, the anti-corruption guideline is really has arrived at the World Bank.
Fortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, you're welcome.